For my second screencast, I'm going to be covering Chapter 5, Community at the Intersection. I chose to focus on the allegory of the cave in the Awakening to a Sense of Justice section of this chapter. So first I'd like to just share with you a claymation retelling of the allegory of the cave by Socrates to give kind of a visual to that story. So here it is.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves. They are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that a prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
So as you can see from that, when we're looking more at what Thurman describes as an experience of awakening, we can see that in the story, the slave leaving the cave is when he has his experience of awakening. We also touched a little bit in chapter 5 here on crucible moments, which we had discussed earlier in the Johnson's text in chapter 3. So a crucible moment is just a moment or a memorable moment that has an impact on our development. So an example of a crucible moment for a famous leader is this statement from Nelson Mandela, where he says, "If I had not been in prison, I would not have been able to achieve the most difficult task in my life, and that is changing yourself." So for him, his crucible moment was his time in prison. It wasn't a pleasant moment, but as we learned in the Johnson text, a crucible moment doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It can be achieving something that we worked really hard for. But a lot of times it tends to be a moment when we fail and we realize that we are human, and it gives us that chance to rediscover who we are, kind of breaks us down, and so we are able to then build ourselves back up from that experience. So Thurman, in the Fluker text, he talks about sharing our crucible moment, and he says, "What is discovered in private must be witnessed to in the world." So what he's saying is when we have that crucible moment and we rediscover ourselves, we must present that new self-awareness in our actions and in our words and in the way that we reach out to other people. So going back to the allegory of the cave, when the slave left the cave and had his crucible moment, his moment of awakening, he wanted to share that with the other slaves, because he knew what he was seeing was something that they needed to see. He knew that it wasn't only about him, but it was about everybody. And so that leads me into my final point, which is about community. And this chapter has been focusing at community at the intersection. And we can build community through our personal connections with one another. So in the story, the slave knew he couldn't be free when the others weren't. So he needed to go and share his story because they weren't free, he wasn't free. And that's a concept that's been throughout this whole text, as far as building up the other so that we can be built up. We build them up. It goes in a circle. So just one final quote from the Johnson text, the Fluker text, and this is on page 144. About justice, and he says, justice begins with awakening to the self and to the other, and realizing that one cannot be free and equal until all are free and equal. So that was my screencast here. I have my references, and I hope that you saw a little bit more insight into the allegory of the cave and what that means when we're talking about justice.